Ahora Fernando, dime tú, cuando quieras, cuando voy, te enseño. Okay, so we're taking just a few extra minutes to allow few people coming in a bit late. Okay.
Of course, doesn't need to be German time.
Okay. Another general chair is in, so we have the legal number. Give me the sign and I will start. All right. Okay, so welcome everybody to the second day of NLDB. First day was pretty nice yesterday, I think, lots of people, and the second day hopefully will be even better. Before we start, and we will start with the second keynote of the conference, just before we start, I have a couple of practical announcements. One is about the proceedings. Some people have been asking about the proceedings. Some people have been complaining as well about the proceedings, rudely to me. Please do not do that. We were promised originally by Springer that proceeding would have been online by Monday. Then by Monday night, we got a message from them after our inquiry that they had some technical problems and they are scrambling to try and solve it as soon as possible. We are in constant contact with them. The latest message was from a few hours ago, basically during the night. And they said that they were really trying to get the proceedings online by the end of today. We apologize for that, but of course, as you might understand, it is outside our control. I mean, the only thing we can do is keep bugging them, right? They should be online soon. I am also interested in that. I'm also an author like you and Paolo as well. The other thing is about the dinner tonight. You have seen in the program. We have a very packed, tight schedule today. We have a lot of talks. There are 15 talks, if I count correctly. The meeting point should be here outside the main hall at 6 p.m. o'clock. Please be on time for that. Or you can go directly to the point indicated in the map, which is just further down the road, but we can just walk there together. As long as we are all there at 6, we cannot be late because there will be a bus waiting for us, right? And that also means let us all try to be on time with the talks. And this goes for the chairs of the sessions and the authors themselves, okay? Thank you very much for your collaboration. And now a few more people have come in the meantime, very well. And so, without further ado, let us start with the program of today. And we will start today with the second keynote, which will be given by Lucie Flek. Lucie is a professor at the University of Marburg in Germany. And before that, she has a very interesting bio in terms of affiliations, if you look at that. She has been notably, she was before Marburg, she was leading a research group at Amazon Alexa on conversational agents and NLP. But she has been, and correct me if I'm wrong here, Lucie, in and out between academia and industry. At some point, she was also at the research team at Google, and among the academic institutions, she was also at TU Darmstadt and other places, University College of London. So very, very interesting background. Now, in terms of research, Lucie touched in her work several areas of NLP, of natural language processing, computational linguistics, and I was trying to find some kind of common factor, and that probably is very related to the topic of her keynote today, because Lucie's work in NLP always revolved around the human factor, the people. So there are connections with psychology and sociology. And in fact, the title of the keynote today, as you can see on the screen, is User-Centric Natural and Language Understanding, which in which Lucie will enlighten us about all these topics at the crossroads between the human, the user, and the language technology. Lucie, if you can hear us, the floor is yours. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. I hope you are all enjoying the conference. I'm really sorry I can't be there with you physically in person at the end, but I'm happy for the opportunity to, at least virtually, tell you a little bit more about our research. And I hope you will find it interesting, even online. So what I would like to talk about today is this focus of our group on user-centric natural language understanding. And what does it mean, and how we even got to this topic. So we've been working a lot in the past with psychologists and sociologists and like human scientists in general. And we've seen that, for them, it's like very, very natural to work with the default hypothesis that people are very different in how they express themselves, how they use the language. It depends on personal background. It depends on their preferred style. It depends on how they want to show their affinity to various social groups, or even on what their current communication goal in the current group is. And at the same time, people vary in how they interpret the language. So this whole interpretation of a message is basically a social product. So we read the text in the context of our cultural environment, given our background, and so on. Just a recent example from Twitter, somebody being sarcastic about how people don't pay enough attention to the war news, and saying, okay, we can focus on important stuff instead, like a movie star slapping a comedian, referring to the Oscar ceremonies recently. And another person reacting to it like, yes, of course, you are right, it's terrible. So not everybody really gets things like sarcasm or like interpreting the messages in the same way. So my takeaway is it kind of makes sense to model both sides personally, right? To try to assume what this person might mean with these statements, and what a person might understand with a given statement. But if you look at our NLP models these days, like most of the classification applications we do, say in social media, things like sentiment analysis, emotion prediction, hate speech, sarcasm detection, this kind of stuff, it's very, very often it's generic, kind of intended for any user that's out there. So our models would assume that, okay, in one language, we have words that have different meaning dependent on their sense in different semantic contexts, and we model this context. But the models would still mostly assume that one context has the same meaning for all the users. And I argue that this is different from what we call user-centric approach that we want to take to model this this kind of perspectivist attitude. I believe there's been a nice talk yesterday about it also from Enrique. So I'm one more fan for taking personalized approach to NLP and natural language understanding as well. And why? Because if you look around like the related fields, then you would say nowadays personalization and this kind of user-centric approach is very natural, right? I mean, in information retrieval, we know from since 70s that, okay, obviously, even when the users write down the same query, different users have different information needs with this query, and they might mean different things, and we should serve them based on that. Like if you type in your phone nowadays a pizzeria, then you wouldn't expect to see a result, a pizzeria in New York or in Shanghai, just because it's the most frequented pizzeria link in the world. But you would expect to see a list of pizzerias in your neighborhood which are open, where you can go for dinner, right? So it's kind of natural for us to assume in certain fields that this personalization is part of it. And there is essentially no reason why we shouldn't do the same thing also with our NLP classification models. So now, if we agree that personalization is a good thing, then the next question is how can we actually do it technically? So how can we learn on top of this text level also these user representations that we can add to our system? So one very straightforward kind of default approach or easy approach would be to start with determining manually some user groups, right? Label the users with those groups, and then correlating the words that people use with those groups, and see which words or which expressions are significantly different between those groups. You can do that, and you get some results out. But generally, it turns out it's ethically a pretty bad idea to do. Because first of all, you have to predefine a discrete set of labels into which you want to categorize people. And you might already have quite some biases in how you define these labels, how many of these labels you use, how you call them. And secondly, you are kind of putting a fixed label on the user where you're saying, okay, this is how you behave because you are a teenage woman, and then this is how it stays forever because we stamped you with this. And this is not really how it works in practice, right? You can see that there are many issues with these assumptions, and this is kind of troublesome, no matter if people label themselves or people get labeled by other people. When you try to crowdsource this and essentially let external annotators judge who other people are, it gets even much worse. And we've shown in our past work that one actually emphasizes lots of stereotypes in this type of approach, and we even increase the bias in the machines by adapting this kind of explicit labeling attitude. So I argue it's better that we try to just characterize people and learn user representations based on what characterizes people in a given social situation, right? So we have two requirements on these types of representations. First of all, we want to learn the representation of a user in some sort of unsupervised manner. So we don't really want to come up with a predefined boxes beforehand who the people are and why they should be different. Secondly, we want to have these representations vary in different situations, because one person can change their kind of language profile in terms of style and topics based on the community that they are talking to. So if you think your work environment and your friends' environment, you might be interested in completely different things and also using completely different type of language when you talk to your peers. So how to do this technically? The first part, learning the users in an unsupervised manner, that's relatively easy. Like we take here inspiration from the classical word embedding setup. So you can learn dense representations of words in the vector space, which kind of helps you to figure out their similarity. And in the similar way, when you extend paragraph to vec, you can learn user vectors based on everything they're ever said, right? So this is called user to vec. It was first published in 2016 by Silvio Amir. And it's basically a paragraph to vec extension which says, okay, we model the probability of the words that this user is likely to say, which distinguishes them from other users. And this is an experiment where we took all the public profiles of Twitter, so all like several hundreds, thousands of Twitter celebrities. And you can see that based on their user to vec embeddings, we would have people who talk in a similar style and about similar topics closer together, like Katy Perry being somewhere around Amber Rose and Miley Cyrus. You judge me if that makes sense or not. But they would be also completely on the opposite side of the vector space than, for example, American football players on Twitter. And looking closer into those embeddings, we see that they actually distinguish both the stylistic components and the topical components of the user vocabulary. So you will also find a dimension which is kind of more around gender, more around age, and so on. But okay, this solves a way that you don't have to create explicit categories. You can just create the vector space and then see how the vector space is segmented in terms of which users are close together. But this doesn't solve this kind of having different representations for the users in different situations, right? And for that, we again look at what's been happening in the word representation world. And we take a parallel from the contextualized word embeddings, where you have a word like mouse, and you know that in the contextualized word representations, you would obtain a different vector for mouse if it appears around cheese and eating, or like mouse loving cheese. And you would take a different representation if it appears around things like clicking and computer. And in the same way, we suggest to contextualize the users based on their social network. So you can imagine you have a conversation, say on Twitter or on Reddit or any social media, and you initialize it with these user history vectors like this user to vec and so on. And then you contextualize based on the walks of the network whom these users are talking to in the conversation. So you basically treat the neighboring users as the sentence context for this user. And this way you obtain different representations for users talking in some hobby group and users talking in, say, a political subreddit or a work-related subreddit and so on. So now, so much for the idea on how to represent the users. Now, let's have a look a bit into how to plug this into the end tasks and in which tasks this can be useful. So we noticed that apart from representing the social context, like whom the users are talking to, another important thing on social media is to represent also the temporal context with some sort of dynamics, because users or people actually develop over time. And when you take all the information about a certain person, like what they posted in their timeline over the past 5 years, not all of it is going to be relevant, and you want to model some temporal factors to see what of it can actually be useful for you for contextualizing the current information. So we ran case studies in many different areas, from mental health over sarcasm, opinion, stance analysis to fake news, and looked into how the social and temporal context play a role. So an example of a task that you would be addressing in the mental health area, you have a tweet like this. Say, I was there alone, all my friends left, so I tried to kill myself. And your classification task is to predict if this is a real suicidal ideation tweet, so the person is severely depressed and might need some attention of a professional or some peer group support, or if it's just some sort of like jokey tweets or something out of content or out of context, for example, just a citation from some lyrics of a song or from some movie and so on. So if you look at a tweet like this standalone, you might say, okay, it looks pretty serious, but it's quite hard to tell. And then, oops. And then you see that in the history of that person, they actually talk a lot about playing games, going to like Counter-Strike tournaments, and you also see in their network there are many passionate online game players. So you will realize that this tweet is about actually finishing the online game where the person was the last player left in the gaming room, and they had to kill the player in order to quit the game so that they can restart it and play again. So this is so we used a data set which was manually annotated by 2 psychologists, roughly 30,000 users, which were observed over 10 years. So roughly 2 million tweets for these 30,000 users. And they were selected based on various keywords that might indicate suicidal phrases, and then annotated by 2 psychologists to see if this is a real suicidal intent or more kind of a out of context keyword-based issue. And in this example with the Counter-Strike, it's been relatively straightforward, right? Like it's enough for you to see either the social environment or something from the past, and you can say what's going on. But there are some cases where this gets more complex. So sometimes the past tweets can actually confuse the classifier, because in the more distant past, the person was feeling completely different and actually, like in this example, doing fine, but then at the end, in the more recent tweets, actually showing a worsening depression and leading to suicidal thoughts. So not all the past statements are equal, and you want to model it in some time-sensitive way. So we take inspiration from the work in the medical domain by Vaitas et al., which was used for patient data which are taken in different, like very varied time intervals. And we use the same for our tweet timelines, so representing the content of the user posts in time-sensitive way, taking this delta t between the posts in the account into account. And we represent the tweets with BERT fine-tuned on predicting the 8 basic emotions from the logic wheel, like sadness, anger, joy, and so on, surprise. So we have these emotionally encoded, contextualized word past tweets, and then we run a time-sensitive LSTM over those to basically upweight the tweets that were posted more recently with the shorter time intervals. And we innovated the setup a little bit by, well, not only by the temporal difference, but also by explicitly detecting the emotional phases, because when you have the LSTM cells, then you can look at what's happening with the short and long-term memory, which are these two pretty equations here on the top. For the interested ones, you can find more details in the paper. Basically, it just says judge the weights of accumulated emotions over time. And we say that whenever the memory omits lots of the historical emotional context when a new example comes, then there is a new emotional phase starting. So we explicitly label these kind of distinct emotional phases when there is a lot of large updates in the LSTM. And then we put these detected emotional phases as an extra information about the user timeline into the neural network. So what you see here on the right side is basically the representation of at the bottom of the historical timeline of the user, which we encode to MLBERT, put into the time-sensitive LSTM. Going up, we extract the different emotional phases, run a phase-based convolution over them, and then concatenate it with the emotionally fine-tuned BERT representation of the current tweet, and then try to predict if this is a suicidal intent or not. And we would see that this actually brings significant improvements, not only over using no history of a user using just the current tweet, but also over using just the back of words history or just sequentially encoded history without the time sensitiveness and without the phases. So we would get to results on the recall on detecting 3 out of 5 suicidal intents to detecting 4 out of 5 suicidal intents, which I believe might be an important difference for real life applications. And this kind of like more advanced modeling of the temporal history of the user is important not only in this grim topic of mental health, but also in other kinds of tasks. So we looked next at predicting the opinions and opinion dynamics, because we were thinking, okay, knowing user history might be very useful for understanding what the person will think about the next topic. Which opinion will they have on it? So first we looked at existing data sets. This has been a stance polarity data set from 2016 with about 400,000 annotated posts from about 4,000 authors. So you have like relatively large sequence of posts from one author. Like discussing the traditional political topics like gun control, abortion, and so on. And we wanted to see, okay, does some nice advanced user modeling of the historical context help us to predict A, what their opinion is, and B, if they are likely to change it. Unfortunately, the main insight here was that once people are ready to express their opinion in social media, they almost never change it. So the data set has turned out to be underwhelming in terms of what's in the sequences, because people are very stubborn when discussing these opinionated topics, even when you look at this period of over like 10 years. So modeling the user priors, like knowing something about the history of the user, is useful. It's useful to know also user opinions on other topics. If you look at the correlation metrics here on the right, you will see that if you know like person's opinion on something like abortion, then you have a 95% accuracy on predicting their opinion on gay marriage, for example, even though you never saw any of their posts on that topic. So the static priors are useful, but this kind of more advanced temporal modeling doesn't really need to lead to anything because, well, you see on these graphs on the right how the user opinion polarity develops over time. There's not really much to model. However, things look very different when you look at more fine-grained opinions. So we decided to create our own data set, which doesn't only look at the binary polarity flips, which are rare, but which look at, for example, radicalization of people's opinion. So we want to look into when do people go from somewhat against the topic to strongly against the topic, or somewhat in favor of an idea to strongly in favor of an idea, or the other way around. Like, are there any effects that we can predict in this direction? And we also assume that there might be some short-term effects where people get presented with some new facts and they agree that their, say, fake news type of opinion was wrong, but then after a while they get back to their original strong persuasion that they were right. And this can be actually forecasted with this kind of contextualized models that we saw in this suicide ideation modeling type of approach. So the data set has been just published on LREC this year. If you want to play around with it, you're very welcome to. This is work in progress. Another area where we see this temporal dynamics playing a role and temporal representations being useful is detecting misinformation spreaders. We see that, okay, first of all, user priors are important here, like modeling personality, such as openness to experience, can distinguish between fake news spreaders and real news spreaders, so to say. We see that emotions are actually correlating with the political preference and indirectly with misinformation spreading. But what's interesting for us in terms of temporal modeling is that just from looking at how the semantic similarity between the user representations in the network changes over time, and the social interaction between users changes over time, we can predict if they follow a fake news spreader or real news spreader pattern. So the fake news spreaders would tend to kind of form more compact groups. So like all the people would kind of retweet posts about the same topic at the same time, and forming kind of closer connections, while the real news spreaders would be kind of more varied. And when we look at the dynamics of both the semantic similarity graphs and the social graphs, we can see that even if we don't care about what is the current topic of the discussion, we can distinguish the behavior from fake news spreaders and real news spreaders. So that's before the importance of the temporal modeling, but I kind of primed you for this social graph and social modeling importance. So let me now tell you a little bit about when the social contextualization of the post is useful. So let's look first at the same mental health or suicidal ideation data set that we talked about earlier, with these 30,000 users. The advantage of this data set is that it also has many social connections where users follow each other or quote or reply or mention each other. So we can also test the hypothesis here that people kind of copy each other's behavior, and that's been a theory or many theories in psychology that people kind of assimilate to each other even in this context. So for example, when a user follows a celebrity and the celebrity kind of tries to starts to show some depressive or even suicidal behavior, then the follower might start showing the same just to feel kind of closer connected to the celebrity. And this kind of social contextualization again helps to disambiguate the context of the current tweet that we are trying to label in our predictions. Like in this case on the picture, free me from all this or I will do something myself. Is that a suicidal tweet or not? So we construct a heterogeneous social graph where there are user nodes which are initiated with the user history, like all the representation of the entire text over the user history. And there are links between users, and there are also links from users to tweets based on what they posted, what we want to predict. And this way we can basically expand our previous setup. So the previous setup is kind of the first square on the left, where you see, okay, we took again the current tweet and encode it with the ImmoBird, and we take the historical tweets and encode them with ImmoBird, and then we put that into some sort of temporally sensitive representation for the history. Now, just for the sake of computation, it's not time-sensitive LSTM, but the Hawkes-based mechanism, but the idea is very similar, temporal discounting. And on top of all this, we add the social graph, and we learn a graph convolution network to improve the prediction of the suicidal intent label of the current tweet given this social context. There are some more tricks there to improve the graph learning, like we work with the hyperbolic space, but I will not go into the detail here. You can look into the paper. It's also helping over modeling the graph in the Euclidean space because the user graphs are scale-free in terms of properties. But the important thing that I want to show here is that the social context is actually helping even more than just user history, and especially with the recall. So we can detect more robustly if somebody's serious with their suicidal intent in the tweet when we don't have enough information from the user history. Now, what are other tasks where the social context is useful? For example, sarcasm detection is one of them, where we see clearly knowing the user priors, like knowing was the user in the past actually ever using sarcasm, is informative for recognizing if the current tweet is sarcastic or not. And also knowing whom the users are currently talking to, like if the other users in the thread are likely to use sarcasm, or if the other users in the thread are speaking about a topic that is more prone to sarcasm, like politics, for example, rather than sports, then you can make better predictions. So in this experiment, we used a existing data set of 30,000 sarcastic tweets, which was labeled by other people saying explicitly, oh, hey, they were just being sarcastic. And we extended with the user history for all those users from their Twitter timelines. So at the end, we have a couple of million tweets, if you also count the historical ones. Like we have around 1,000 posts per user on average. And we see that moving from judging the current tweet for sarcasm only to judging the tweet with the user history and the user network, using again this heterogeneous graph where users interacting are connected and the tweets they post are connected to the users. We can get from something like 70% F-score to something like 84% F-score. So that's relatively large improvement. And we also see that the representations of the users get much better when we contextualize them with the social graph. So on the top picture, you see just the user-centric based on individual history, and on the bottom picture, you see the representations of the users contextualized by their social environment in the conversation thread. And you see the red users are sarcastic, and there is not like one community, but there are like several relatively separate communities using sarcasm in different topical contexts. Good. So now we've seen that it's been pretty useful to embed this user information when we have them in a classification setting. What we are currently looking into as well is if we can use these representations to improve and personalize dialogue systems. So let's say you can learn these user prototypes or typical representations from a large social media, like take the entire Reddit, take the entire Twitter, and you can kind of figure out what the people might be like what are the correlations on their beliefs, their emotions, their preferences, which is kind of what people often do when they talk to other people. Like you hear 3 sentences from a person and you kind of make a background model in your mind of what this person is probably thinking about other topics and what they might be doing in their free time and so on. And then you can kind of update this mental model as you progress in the conversation. When you learn more about the person, you can kind of adjust where you were wrong in your mental profile, right? So the idea is, okay, we can plug this into the conversation model even when we generate like chatbot to human conversations, and we can try to simulate both the chatbot persona and the recipient to alter, for example, the preferred style of the conversation. We've started this experiment on, for example, receptive argumentation, where we've been modeling if the users are more likely to respond to arguments when we paraphrase the arguments in some more kind of friendly and approachable way that's like less conflicting. So instead of saying, you totally shouldn't do this, you say something like, oh, I believe that it actually might get better if you try something like that, and see if the conversations actually improve. So we would build a style control paraphrasing setup and then evaluate it with humans. And what was interesting here that we saw not a general preference for a certain style. So our hypothesis was that, okay, everybody will like this more receptive style more and will kind of engage with the chatbot more. But we saw that this is dependent on the opinion of the human partner in the dialogue. So if somebody in reality believed the same thing as the chatbot, but was only arguing for the sake of completing the task of arguing, then they were thinking that the chatbot was actually too polite, and they should be kind of more aggressive to represent their opinion. And when somebody had in reality the opposite opinion than the chatbot, then when they were arguing, they were thinking the chatbot was actually very rude and should be more polite in or more receptive in arguing about their point of view. So what's the takeaway from this? When you can model these relatively complex user priors in terms of user representations on what their prior beliefs might be, what their preferences might be, you can even discover such correlations between, for example, opinion and style, and you can adjust accordingly. Okay, this person is likely to think that, so my chatbot should be talking more receptive rather than representing the opinion stronger. So there are many interesting new applications of this kind of personalized modeling coming up. Let's see where it takes us to. The last thing I want to briefly mention before we get into discussion are the ethics challenges with this modeling, because obviously you see for understanding the users, we are taking, first of all, lots of data from the individuals, and it's important that the individuals actually have some notion of accepting this type of personalizations and wish this type of personalization. And it's also important to realize that we might be generalizing too much, right? Especially when we have little of a user context and we kind of bootstrap it with the context of a similar user in the network. We might be over assuming and doing sort of stereotypes on who these users are, even when we know that on average this user group is behaving differently. So we have to be really critical and like cautious about what are we modeling there? Are we actually needing these links between this user history and user network and the labels that we are predicting? Is this meaningful and necessary to answer our research questions? We also have to keep in mind that when we model the users, there is kind of a strengthened semblance of objectivity based on the fact that it's a machine deciding and not a human deciding. So people will say, this was predicted by an algorithm that this person is, well, I'll say softly, a bad person. So it must be true, right? And people are kind of prone to argue that when the machine said that, it must be right. So we have to take responsibility for interpreting with caution what the machine is saying about people. And we also need to ask for each task, like, do we really need this data? First of all, how much personalization do the users want? There are tasks where it makes sense to personalize. There are tasks where people actually want to be treated generically and equally without much personalization, even when you have the information available where you could personalize for them. And we also need to scrutinize how much data we are using versus how much data is useful. So for example, for improving something like hate speech prediction, we've seen that using data older than 2 months is actually not necessary, even when we have longer timelines, because the predictions are then pretty much the same. All the information is already there. When you observe the user for something like 60 days, you've seen all you need to see to decide if this is gonna be a hate speech spreader or not. This is very different task from task. And we see also similar trends in information retrieval, right? Like there's been papers on personalizing the search preferences, and there it's been also shown that it's enough to take a couple of days of the user data or for the recommendation systems, and you can forget what the users were doing years ago because it's absolutely not relevant. So questioning the historical importance for the task and the social network importance for the task is always good. That's it from me for today. So takeaways. When we use the language representations enriched with users' historical and social context, we gain increased performance on most of the social NLP tasks or NLP tasks on social media, if you wish. And we hope that this can improve not only classification, but also generation models and dialogue interaction models. And we need to be always cautious about how much data and how much personalizations we actually apply given a task that we are addressing. I'm ready for your questions. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Lucie. And it is time for questions. Yeah.
Hello, Lucie. Great talk. Thank you very much. I'm a social psychologist, not a computer linguistic.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a question because I think there is the right approach. I mean, you have been speaking about all the things that worry me when I see how computational linguistic works. But I have a question because the main aspect of social context is social group. I mean, people belong to social groups, they share reality representation because they belong to social groups. And how are you thinking to approach this? Because there is an individualistic approach in more of the experiments in terms of what one subject thinks or what one subject do. It's true that you are working with different subjects when you see how they interact. But I'm speaking more about sharing the symbolic, not the contact between subjects, mainly how they share a vision of reality. Because that is why you find that a user that has some opinion about abortion have the same opinion about gay marriage, for example, because they belong to a social group.
Mm-hmm.
Why? How? If you have something, if you are thinking about.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Thank you. We are actually currently conducting experiments in this direction as well. We get one upcoming paper at NAGR this year, so that's next month, on modeling echo chambers and the interaction between personal, like sociodemographic aspects and stances towards topics and network aspects like forming echo chambers. And we would see there that combining the language component with the social graph component and basically taking into account explicit community modeling and like saying, okay, this has been a cluster in the social network, which has lots of like echo chambered interaction, reiterating the same opinion within just interacting within the group and not with other parts of the social network, helps us also to interpret their other language behavior with other posts. So we definitely indirectly see this kind of effect with the network modeling, which is the way we are trying to get to. So again, we drop the idea that as a computer scientist we will ever be able to assign perfect labels to who do people feel they belong to, and we try to figure this out from the data of the social interactions. So you would see on different tasks, the social graph information is kind of more useful to augment the prediction quality. On other tasks, it's less useful. And what is another interesting aspect of it is also that some of the tasks are more individualistic and some of the tasks are more dependent on how people perceive it. So for example, when you look at the sarcasm task, there is a difference on what people report as the author of the tweet. Like, I was trying to use sarcasm. This was a sarcastic tweet posted by me. And it's like I was being sarcastic, and a different what people perceive as sarcasm. Like when somebody else says, oh, this was definitely a sarcastic tweet. And the second part is actually very difficult to understand why the recipients will interpret the message in a certain way. And we see now that in NLP, this distinction is often not done properly. And we mix up the prediction of things like hate speech or sarcasm based on if the person intended it that way or if another person understood it that way. And I think modeling these users and seeing if the author of the tweet or the recipient of the message is more important in the prediction will also give us this social information of how much they are adjusting the messaging to their audience for the current communication. I'm not sure if that answered your question.
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Okay.
Yep, there's another question.
Hi, thank you for the talk. I was wondering how GDPR affects your work and how you, for example, mitigate any privacy legal issues that you may have with your work.
Oh, thank you for the question. Oh yes, GDPR affects our work. So first of all, we try not to store any original content, store just the learned representation, but even the learned representations need to be kind of prone to any privacy sensitive extractions. So we are actually working a lot in the differentially private modeling and the privacy area to see how we can make the algorithms more formally private when we use more information. And we are in discussion also with legal researchers on this, or AI legal folks. And our take there is that the current approach to GDPR, where people say, okay, the best thing is to use as little user data as possible, like only the data that is absolutely necessary, is actually not safer for the users if you don't provide any formal privacy guarantees. Because when you have fewer data per user or less data per user, they are even more prone to privacy leaks when the user mentions something sensitive in that. So when you use instead the whole user timeline, for example, but you apply differentially private learning on that to kind of have a more robust representation of the generic things about the user, but filter out all the potentially sensitive information, you get a better result in your classification, and the user is safer. So that's our take on that.
Okay, thank you very much. And we have to go on with the program. Was there a question? Only if it's very, very quick, Paolo. Thank you.
Yes, it is. We have a very strict program chair that something useful in order to, I mean, not to have any delay. So thanks very much, Lucie, for the interesting talk. So the previous question somehow was related to the fairness topic because of the GDPR and so on. Mine is related to transparency. So your attempt in this work where you enrich the language representation with user, temporal, and social context is in this direction, the explainable artificial intelligence, let's say, path. But at the end, how much interpretable is what we could represent maybe with using a convolutional neural network graph, or the GAT representation you show. So sometimes maybe for a common, well, for a user who is not very much into this graph representation, is not maybe so interpretable what the algorithm could represent and show. So thanks.
Yeah, thank you for this question, Paolo. That's there. I think we are getting to the general problem of representation learning and neural networks. So many people answered this in long discussions before me. So I won't start getting overtime there. But simple answer: when we have a labeled subset of the training data where we actually know some explicit information about the users, we can at least try to map the dimensions, and we see that the dimensions that we are learning in the dense representations are actually often corresponding to explicit dimensions that we would like to represent with user features. Yeah, how interpretable it is, I would argue we at least try to look at the attention over the graph attention networks, but attention is interpretation is always a questionable statement as well. So I will leave it to that and to more discussion over the coffee break on this. Also, many of my co-authors on this type of work are attending the conference. So feel free to catch up with them for the follow-up too, and have fun for the rest of the day. Thank you for having me.
Okay, thank you, Lucie, and yeah, we can thank the speaker again. Lucie, you are welcome to stay with us online if you want, of course. And let's get on with the program. And I invite the first speaker, Raksha, is that you? I should have your